Hey everyone, and welcome to the RedefineFX YouTube channel. If you are completely new here, my name is Jesse, and today I'll give you an introduction to 3ds Max and all of its main features. So when you first open the software, first you're gonna see the viewports. So whichever viewport is selected has this orange outline around it. So you get your perspective view, front, top, left. So that's this whole area here is just your viewport. Then you get your scene explorer where all of your objects in the scene will be listed. We also have our command panel where we're going to create and control a lot of the objects and modifiers inside 3ds Max. You have our timeline for animation. We have viewport controls, animation controls, auto key, set key. We're gonna cover that. You can play back your animation here. Then up here with this toolbar, you have some of the most common buttons for some of the most common features that you're gonna end up using. So of course we have undo and redo, link, select, and then we have move, scale, rotate. Then we have snap. Then we have some align and mirror features, material editor, render. So we're gonna go over these. And then of course you have your usual menus up here with all of the different things that you can do. Now, important to note that you can move a lot of these menus around and have them sort of dock to wherever you want them to be, right? So whenever you see these dotted double lines, it means that you can just drag this and move it wherever you want. So if you have two monitors, you can just put this on your second monitor, super helpful, or you can just close it, right? You can do this with the command panel as well. You can just undock it, move it wherever you want, and you can just grab it again, hover along the edge, and when it turns blue, you can just snap it right there. Now you can also expand the menu like this. Now if you lose any menu and you want to bring it back, you can just right click into any empty space and you can just say, let's say Scene Explorer, it's gonna disappear, right click. And if it's not in this menu, then you can just go under Customize, Show Explorers, Scene Explorer, and it's gonna bring it back for you. So just to get something going here, we're gonna create a box. So here under the command panel, I'm under Create tab, and I can just click on Box. Now I can also select Auto Grid, which means it's going to snap to the grid of the scene. So now I can just drag out a box, so click and hold, and then let go, and then move your mouse up, and click to lock in the height, and then you can right click to end the creation process. So this takes a little bit of practice. If you're completely new, just click around and try to just get used to this and make a few boxes. So now if I want to make this view full screen, I can just do Alt+W, which will maximize this view. So again, very important shortcut, Alt+W to minimize or maximize your currently selected viewport. So now to navigate the scene, you're gonna use your middle mouse button or your wheel on your mouse. So if I just click down on the wheel and hold, I can pan. So again, that's the middle mouse button, you just click and hold to pan. Now if I add Alt into the mix, so Alt plus the middle mouse button, I can orbit around. So play with this, right? Pan, then plus Alt is orbit, and then if I add Control, so Control, Alt, and middle mouse button, I'm moving in and out. You can also just scroll the wheel to basically zoom in and out like this. So just to recap one more time, simply scrolling the middle mouse button will move you in and out like this. Clicking and holding it is pan. Clicking and holding it plus Alt is orbit. And Control Alt plus middle mouse button moves you in and out precisely like this. So just practice around until you get used to this. Right, so if I click, the outline goes from yellow to blue, so the object is now currently selected. I can hit W to move on the X, Y, or Z axis, or I can also just select this square and move it around however I want. Then I can hit E on my keyboard to rotate, again on any axis I want, and I can hit R to scale. I can also scale it on any axis here, and I'm hitting Control Z to undo what I'm doing. So these are three very important shortcuts on your keyboard that you'll be using all the time. It's the W, E, R. So I'll just delete this box and make a new nice one here because I want to show you how to copy objects. So if I hit W to move and then hold Shift and drag, I'm creating a copy. So again, select, hold Shift and drag, you create a copy. You can also hold Shift, drag, and then select that you want to create, let's say, 5 copies. And it's going to copy them with the same amount of gap between them, right? They're equally apart, and we have 5 new copies that are equally far away. What I can also do is copy the objects with the rotate and scale as well. So I can hit E to rotate, hold Shift, and then rotate to make a copy. And again, I can do maybe 5 copies, and I'm just copying it right at that same angle 5 times. And of course, I can also do that with scale. So I can hit R, hold Shift, and scale this down, hit OK, and I've created a new copy of that same box. So just to recap one more time, that's W to move, E to rotate, R to scale, and then hold Shift and perform the action to create a copy. And you can also create many copies. So if you look over to the Scene Explorer, you can see that all of the boxes that we've created are now listed here. I can select them again just by clicking on them. I can freeze them. So freezing means that they cannot be modified in any way. So if, let's say, I want to freeze this, I can just click on this snowflake. And now if I select everything and I move, you see everything will move except for the frozen object. The frozen object cannot be modified, which can be very helpful in a lot of situations. So this is good for you to know, right? So I can just freeze, let's say, these 4, and they cannot be moved. I can unfreeze them again to modify them. Now if, let's say, I wanted to just freeze this object here, the quickest way is just to right click and say freeze selection, and I can just right click and say unfreeze all to unfreeze all the frozen objects. You can also right click on an object and you get a lot of different settings. So what I can do is maybe select these 3 objects and just say hide selection. So now the objects are still technically in the scene, but as you can see, they are hidden. The eye icon is not there anymore. So I can unhide them just by clicking the eye icon here. I can hide them again. Another useful feature is the isolation mode. So if, let's say, you have a lot of objects in the scene, but you only want to work on this particular box and none of the others, you can just do Alt+Q, and this will activate the isolation mode, which means that right now you haven't deleted anything, everything is still in the scene, but you are in an isolation mode where you only get to work on this particular selected object. And you can escape isolation mode by either clicking this button here that says isolate selection to go back to where you were, right? So you can just use this, or you can just use the shortcut Alt+Q to enter the isolation mode and then click this to get out of it. All right, so we're covering quite a few features here pretty quickly. So I would encourage you to always pause the video, go into Max, and try all of this out for yourself, because it's not until you do it yourself and you actually click around and try to freeze objects, try to move objects, rotate them, copy them. It's not until you do it that it will really register with you. So I'll just delete all of this and hit Alt+W again. And just want you to know you don't just have to create boxes, right? You have a cone, sphere, cylinder, torus is basically a donut here. You also have a tube. Now you can also go under extended primitives to get some cooler objects. So one of the most popular is the torus knot. So we can just drag out a torus knot here, right? So the first drag will control the size, the second drag controls the thickness of the tube essentially, and you can just move it up to sit nicely in our scene. So just to return to the viewports here, we have our perspective view, right? Then you have your front view. So this is orthographic, meaning this doesn't have any sort of perspective to it. It's only the front view. Then you have the top view and you have the left view. Now if you notice, the perspective view is the only one that is shaded. The other ones are wireframe. So if I make the perspective again full screen, I can set this to wireframe override, and I will also only see the wireframe of the object. I can also set this to default shading. I can also enable edged faces, so I can essentially see the polygons or triangles of the object. You can turn this on and off with the F4 shortcut. So that's F4 on your keyboard to turn edged faces on and off. You'll be using this all the time. It's very helpful because if, let's say, I create a box, unless I have edged faces selected, I can't really see how many polygons it's made out of. So if I select the box and go under this modify panel, I can increase the length, width, and height segments to give it more detail. And again, without edged faces, it just looks like a box. So this is something you'll use all the time. Now, speaking of the modify panel here, whenever you create an object, the way to change its settings is under this modify tab. So for example, for the torus knot, I can increase or decrease the radius. Same for the amount of segments. I can play with the radius of the thickness of the tube, how many sides it has, and some other settings. So the workflow in 3ds Max always starts with the create tab. So you will create an object and you will switch over to the modify tab to modify it. Now you don't just have to create geometry. Right now we're under the geometry tab, so we're creating boxes, spheres, but you can also switch into shapes. So this way you will basically create splines, right? Circles, rectangles, lines. Then you can also create lights. So we can create an Arnold light, which we will later. If you have V-Ray installed, this is where you will access your V-Ray lights. You can create cameras here. You also have some helper objects here, some space warps and forces, and also some systems. So this is for like bones, animation, bipeds, and stuff like that. So creation tab is usually where you will start, and then you will switch over to the modify tab to again access the settings for the individual objects. Right, so continuing on, if we go back into this view here, you have this little plus icon that you can click on, and you can say configure viewports. And if you go under save frames, you can just enable the 12 field grade, either 12:9 or 4:3. And then you can hit shift+f to enable save frames. Or you can also just click here under perspective and say show save frames. So this is very helpful whenever you want to center an object in your scene. It gives you a grid overlay that shows you, the golden ratio, for example, so you can just frame it nicely to the side, or you can just frame it into the middle. So again, shift+f to enable save frames. And you can see it's also cutting out the top and the bottom. And this is influenced by your render settings. So right now we are in HDTV 1280x720. So it's giving us the 16:9 ratio. So again, if I enable the save frame, it's gonna give me that 16:9 screen, so I can see exactly what my render view will be. Now, another thing I want you to know is you don't have to be stuck with this layout of the viewports. You can also again click on this plus sign, go to configure viewports, and you can select layout, and you can change the layout to anything you want. So this is the default one where each one is the same size, but you can also just select this one here, let's say, and say okay, because I know that I'm always using the perspective view the most, and the other views I don't care about as much, but I still want access to them. So you can get this kind of a view, which depending on maybe how big your monitor is or how many monitors you have, this can save you a lot of time. So again, just want you to know that this is here under configure viewports, and just check out all these layouts. There are many here, and see which one works best with your workflow. So just to give us more space, I'll close the Scene Explorer. So I'll just drag it away from the edge and just close it. I can also make the command panel a bit smaller too, and make our perspective view full screen. So again, Alt+W. And I want to go over some of these main buttons up here because you'll be using those a lot. So first, of course, we have just undo and redo. Then you have select and link. So if I make another object here, and let's make it a sphere. And let's say I want to link this torus to the sphere, so that whenever I move the sphere, the torus will move with it. I can just select and link this button here. I can click on the torus knot because that's the one I want to link to something, and just click and drag onto the sphere. And then just get out of that link mode by selecting your select object tool again. Then I can select the sphere, hit W to move, and now they're linked and they're moving together. Now if I wanted to unlink them, I can just select both of them and select unlink selection, and it will break the link between them, and now they're individual objects again. So if I move the sphere, it moves on its own, and the torus knot move on its own as well. Then you have this bind to space warp feature. I want you to know how that works because it's pretty cool. So I'll just delete these, and let's make a plane just on our grid here. Right click, and then let's give it maybe 100 by 100 segments, so they have a lot of polygons. Now you can hit G on your keyboard to hide the home grid. I didn't mention this before, right? So you get the default grid in your scene. You can hit G to hide that. And then I can go under Create, Space Warps, and I can select Geometric Deformable, and I'll just select Ripple. And you can enable Auto Grid and just drag out this Ripple Space Warp in the middle of your plane, and then raise up like this, and then right click to end the creation process. I'm going to select this Bind to Space Warp button, select the ripple, and connect it to the plane. And you see now it will use this plane to be influenced by the space warp. So now what I can do is play with the amplitude, and I can play with the phase to control the waves. Super cool, right? So bind to space warp, just wanted you to know how that works. So I'll just delete this for now. Hit G again to reveal my grid. And let's go under Create, Extended Primitives, Torus Knot, and create a new torus knot. And I'm repeating some of these steps because I want you to get used to this, and so that you know where to go and where to find things. So we have another torus knot, and continuing on. All right, so next up we have our selection tools. So by default, you'll be selecting everything. That's why it says all. But if let's say you have a bunch of geometry and a bunch of shapes here. So if I go under Create Shapes, and I create a bunch of circles, which are shapes, and then I create another box, which is a geometry, I can just set this to shapes, and then I will only select the shapes, even though the geometry is within my selection region. I can switch this to geometry, and now I'm only selecting geometry in the scene, ignoring all of the shapes, right? So pretty simple to understand. You can also do this for lights, cameras, helpers, all that. Next up, you have your default select object tool. So I think you know how that works, right? This is just how you select objects. Then you have select by name and shortcut H. So it's good that you remember this shortcut. You will use it all the time. So you can either just click this to select by name in your scene, or you can just hit H. And if I know I just want to select the torus knot, I can just double click and select that. So whenever you have a scene with a lot of objects, it's super easy to just hit H, find the object you're looking for, and it's selected in the scene. So right now when I'm making a selection, you can see I'm making a rectangle, right? So that's controlled by this. I can switch this to a circle, and now I'll be just creating a circle selection tool. So this is actually helpful whenever you have, let's say, a sphere and you just want to select maybe the polygons coming from the middle. You can just switch this to a circular selection mode, and then you just create a nice selection like a circle like this, which would be hard to do with a rectangle. So again, this is good to know that it's here. This one says the window/crossing. So this controls which condition has to be met for the object to be selected. So just watch what happens. This is what it's set to right now. You can just click to switch between the two modes. Right, so right now it says crossing. So whenever the selection tool is crossing an object, it will be considered to be inside of the selection. If I switch this like this, I have to cover the entire object for it to be selected. If I only cross it, you see it doesn't get selected anymore. Even though I'm like crossing over it, it doesn't meet the condition. It has to be entirely inside the selection region to be selected. So that's how that works. So then you have your usual WER, right? Move, rotate, and scale. So if I select the select and move tool, I will be able to move this object around. Now you can also right click to get this dialog box, and you can maybe set these values to 0, 0, and 0. And this way you know that the object is perfectly in the origin point of your scene. You can do this for these as well. So you can right click on the rotate and you can plug in the exact rotation that you want. So maybe I can do 90 degrees on the x-axis and it will just rotate perfectly for me, just from the dialog box. Same for scale as well, right? So move, rotate, scale, and right click to access the settings here. So next up you have this select and place. And this is helpful if you have, let's say, like a terrain and you want to place an object on top of the terrain perfectly. Let me just show you how that works. So if I make another box, let's say, I can just select this select and place tool and I can move it, and I'm basically just clicking and dragging and then moving on top of the sphere. And you can see how it will automatically adjust its rotation and position to stay perfectly on top of this surface, right? So I think the easiest way really is just to show you this. So again, if you had, let's say, like a terrain, it's easy to place the object on top of the terrain and have it follow the contour of the terrain like this. So that's how this works. So now let's talk about this local view screen. So by default, when you move an object, the axis is just controlled by your view. Now I can also set this to local and nothing will really change because we haven't rotated the object. So if I rotate this just to demonstrate, I can set this to view, and you can see that even though we rotated the object, the arrows are still pointing the same way. They're not really following the rotation of the object. So if I set this to local, just watch the arrows and what will happen. I'll switch this to local, and now the arrows follow however we rotated the object before. So I can move it on its own local axis. Alright, so next up you have some options here for snapping. I always use this angle snap toggle. And basically the way this works, if I activate it, hit A on my keyboard and rotate, it's rotating in 5-degree angles. It's a bit hard to see, but it's going from 5, 10, 15, 20 degrees. So I can control this by right clicking and say snap angle is set to 5 degrees. I can set it to, let's say, 10 degrees and close this. And now if I hit A and rotate, it's rotating in 10-degree increments. So this is very helpful whenever, let's say, you want to rotate something 90 degrees. I will just hit A to enable this angle snap toggle and then just go until I reach 90 and I know that it's exactly 90 degrees. While without this feature, it's very hard to get the right angle because you're just getting some very random number here and it's never precise, right? So this is something I use all the time. All right, so up here you can create a selection set. So if I select all of this except for maybe this cube, I can call this my set, enter, then I can just deselect. I can click up here and you can see that my set is here. So I can just click on that, and all of those objects that I put into my set are now automatically selected. So this again is very helpful. You're gonna keep using this as you create larger scenes with a lot of objects. This is very helpful. Next up, we have this mirror function. So if I just select this object and let's say I wanna just mirror it, right? So I can just click on mirror and then I can select which axis I want it to be mirrored at. So this is helpful if, let's say, you have two human faces that you want to face each other. So you just hold shift, make a copy of this one, and you select mirror and you just mirror this one to be facing the other. And you may just have to play with the mirror axis to get it just right. Now, as you saw what I just did, I made a copy myself, but what you can do is also just leave this selected, select mirror, and then you can say clone selection, just make a copy, and then you can make an offset, right? So you can just offset the mirrored copy right within this dialog, and you can easily just make a copy from here. So now I have a perfectly mirrored copy on each side. So next up we have align. So you can align objects to one another. So I can just select the sphere, click on align, and then I can click on the box because that's the object I want to align it to, and I can select position X, Y, and Z, and maybe I can do center, center. And so now the sphere is aligned to be right in the center of this box. I can scale it down. So that's how align works. Again, very helpful. All right, so I want to just briefly talk about 3D modeling. So most of the time I will just hit F4 to again reveal the edged faces. And then you want to convert this object into an editable poly. So I'll just right click over here and say editable poly. You can also do editable mesh or editable patch, but 9 times out of 10 I'll just do editable poly. And now if I click on this little arrow, I can reveal the vertices, right? So I can just move this vertex if I want. I can also just modify the edges. So right now I just have this edge selected and I can move the edge. I can select the border. So right now there is no border actually. So if I wanted to reveal a border, I can just select polygon, which will allow me to select the individual polygons. I can hit delete to delete this top polygon. And now if I select border, I can just select this top border and I can move that. So that's what border means, right? There has to be an open edge for it to be considered a border. And then you also have an element. So right now this entire cube is considered an element. Now what I can do is create another box. I can select this cube, which is already an editable poly. I can say attach and attach this cube to it. So now if I go under element, this is actually one object consisting of 2 elements. So this is one element and the other cube is the other element, but it is still one editable poly, right? So that's an important difference. Now, if I wanted to detach this element to be an individual object again, I can just say detach and just say okay. And right now, again, this will be its own object and this will also be its own object. Now, as you can see, the pivot remained over here, right? Like I'm controlling this cube, but the pivot of this cube is all the way back here. Now, if I wanted to fix that and move this pivot to be back in the center of this object, I can just go under Hierarchy tab. So we haven't been here before, right? So pay attention to this one. This is the Create tab, this is the Modify, and this is the Hierarchy tab. And I can just say Effect Pivot Only, and I can say Center to Object. And you can see how the pivot moved. So because I'm affecting the pivot, I can only move the pivot without moving the object. So sometimes it's very useful to maybe move the pivot to the bottom of an object. So I can move the pivot down here and I can unclick Affect Pivot Only. So I'm affecting the cube again. If I hit E to rotate, I am now rotating the cube along this bottom edge, right? So this is actually extremely useful and it's very good for you to know this. So remember, Hierarchy tab, Affect Pivot Only, and then you can move the pivot wherever you want. So I'll just say Center to Object, uncheck Affect Pivot, and now I'm again rotating the cube along the center of it because the pivot is in the center. Now, if we return back to our little modeling project over here, I ended up talking about polygons and elements, right? So if I just wanted to, let's say, extrude this top polygon, I can just select the polygon and I can go under Extrude. And you can either just click on Extrude and then sort of just drag it out visually, or what I prefer to do is just to click on this little dialog box on the settings, and you'll get this little menu here, and then you can very, very precisely just drag up and down and control the height of this extrusion. And then I can just either hit OK to confirm it, or I can just click on plus. It will keep creating another extrude on top of that one. So that's very useful as well. So that's this either confirm or plus, and you can control the height. Now another modeling tool is this inset. So if I, let's say, just select a few polygons, and you can just hit Control, hold Control and keep clicking. And this way you can select several polygons. I can click on Inset, right? And now I can either inset all of these polygons at once, or I can select by polygon. And I can just make an inset for each individual polygon. So I can just do that. And now I can go back to Extrude and maybe just visually extrude this out like this. And now I can maybe do, let's do bevel. And I can maybe just bevel this, play with the amount. And this is essentially how you will model any object you would like, just by using these over and over again. Now, a lot of times you will want to add edges. So you can actually use shortcuts on your keyboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1 selects the vertices, 2 selects the edges, 3 selects the border, right? If you watch over here, 4 on your keyboard selects the polygons, and 5 allows you to select the element. So I'll just hit 2 to select the edge. And now if let's say I wanted to select all of the edges in this particular row, I can just hit ring, right? It will select all of the edges that go around like this. Now, if let's say I wanted to select all of the edges that go around from left to right, I can just hit loop and I'll select all of the edges that go around except for these, because these are actually interrupted by these sort of edges over here, so this doesn't go all the way. So I just need to hold Control and select this edge to be able to move that whole thing. So a lot of times what I will do is just maybe select this edge and click ring, and then you can hold Control and click on polygon over here, and this will actually convert the selection from edges to polygons. So again, in case you didn't catch that, I can hit 2 on my keyboard to be in edge selection mode. I'll select this edge, click on ring to select all the edges that go around this object in this way. Then I can hold Control on my keyboard and select polygon, and it will convert the edge selection into a polygon selection. Now I can also hold Control again and click on vertices, and it will convert the polygon selection into the vertices selection. So all of the verts are now selected that were in the spot of the selected polygons. So these are just some very useful tips and functions that you will just keep on using over and over again as you get to model, you know, cars or anything else. Now one more thing I want to show you is chamfer. So if I just maybe convert this box into an editable poly, maybe select all the edges, do Control A, so all of the edges are selected, and now I can click on chamfer. I can just play with the chamfer amount over here, and you can see how I'm rounding the edges nicely, and then I can play with the amount of segments. So in CG, it's very important to avoid those perfectly sharp edges. So for example, you can do this with the V-Ray edge texture to sort of fake it, or you can do it for real by adding chamfer edges to your geometry to get some nice rounded corners for more realism. So there are obviously a lot of different settings for modeling. There are entire courses just covering 3D modeling. You know, this is something that you can spend your whole life perfecting and getting good at. I mean, there are people who can model a car in 30 minutes, right? But these are basically just the most simple basics that you will use all the time. It's just important that you know what vertices, edges, and polygons are, how to do some basic extrusions, you know, how to move vertices around to control your object. And I will likely do a separate tutorial just diving deeper into 3D modeling, but this should get you going. So now, if let's say you wanted to do 3D text, and I feel like we have to cover that in a complete beginner tutorial for any 3D package, you can just go under Create Standard and you can do Text Plus, and you can just click, and then you can change this to maybe RedefineFX. And you can change the font, of course, to anything you would like. You have your basic text settings here, right? Tracking, leading, the size. And then you have some nice controls here for extrusion. So you can just extrude the text right here. And you can apply bevel just to get those nice edges for some nice reflections. Now the other sort of the longer way of doing this would be just to create a shape. So you can go under Shapes and you can just create a regular text. RedefineFX. Now you notice we don't have any options for extrusion here. What we do have, however, is we can go under rendering and say enable in renderer and enable in viewport. It will actually extrude along the spline and give you a nice tube extrusion along the spline. So you get some nice sort of a 3D, you can use this for something like neon text, neon signs. So right now it's set to radial, I can set it to rectangular, and I'm basically extruding along the spline like this, getting some nice rectangular geometry along the spline. Now I can also just turn that off, and I can go under my modifier list. So here it says modifier list. I can scroll down and just say extrude. And this is my traditional extrude modifier, which allows me to just get that nice 3D text and fill the letters with geometry. right? So you can do this with any shapes. So if let's say I just create a circle here, I can again say enable in viewport, enable in renderer. I can make it radial. I can increase the thickness. And this way I can add geometry to any spline. So right now this is just a circle shape, but I can right click and make it an editable spline. I can expand it, and now I can control the individual vertices of the spline, right? So I can control the circle like this. I can play with the Bezier handles to control how much of a curve I get. I can also right click and change it from Bezier to, let's say, corner, and I'll just get a sharp corner this way. I can also change it to smooth, and I'll get a smooth transition between the two segments here. So right now I'm just controlling the vertex. I can change it to segment, and this way I'm basically controlling just a portion of this shape, or I can just change it to spline, and this way I will just control the entire spline of the object. So that's how this works. Now as you can see, there's not a whole lot of detail in this circle, so if I just make another one, what you can do is go under interpolation and just increase the steps from maybe 6 to 24. And you see we're getting a lot more detail in the circle. So now if I make it an editable spline again, I have a lot more nicer detail in the shape, and I don't get those sharp corners anymore. So now if let's say I make another circle and I'll make a sphere. Now let's say I wanted this sphere to travel along this circle. So what I can do is just select the sphere, go under the motion tab. So we haven't visited this one yet, right? We covered create, we covered modify, hierarchy, where we controlled the pivot. Now we're gonna go under motion tab, and I can say assign controller. I'll go under position, and you can just select position and click on this little assign controller button, and I'll just say path constraint and just say okay. So now it just needs me to select a path, so I'll just click add path and add the circle here. And now if I go forward in my timeline, it automatically applies an animation that goes from 0% to 100%, 100% being a full revolution, meaning from beginning to end. And you can see that the sphere is beautifully traveling along the spline. So I can play with this percent animation to control how far I want it to be on that frame 100. So maybe I only want it to go this far, right? So you get the idea. So that's one of the many different things that you can do under the motion tab by assigning these controllers. All right, so next up, I want to touch on the modifier list. Now this is a huge list. Each one of these modifiers comes with its own set of settings. So we're not gonna dive deep into it, but I just want you to be aware that this modifier list is here. Some of the most common modifiers you will use, for example, is edit poly. So instead of converting the object into an editable poly, you can just use the modifier on top, which allows you to do the same things as converting it into edit poly would, right? So you can model, you can do everything you want, but then you can just turn this modifier off and you're back to that original sphere, which is something you would not be able to do if you just converted it into an editable poly straight up, right? This is just a modifier that you can turn on and off, which is very helpful. So I'll just delete that. Now what you will also use all the time is turbosmooth, which will just allow you to add more geometry to your object and smooth it out. So you can increase the iterations to add more or less geometry. Another one you will use all the time is noise. So I can set the scale of the noise to maybe just 5, and I can play with the strength on the different axes. So this is very helpful for something like when you're trying to create a terrain, maybe ripples of water, or to get any kind of a force field going on. I mean, there are just like an infinite amount of uses for this. So you can play with the scale of the noise, with the strength on the individual axes, and you can also animate the noise to get it to move around and create some organic effects this way. Another pretty cool modifier is twist, which does exactly what it says. It allows you to just twist geometry around on the axis that you want, right? So you can get some pretty cool effects this way also. Then you also have taper, which this is what taper does. I think sometimes it's just easiest to show you than to talk about it. So these are just some pretty basic, simple modifiers that very quickly allow you to get some pretty cool effects. And the easiest way to learn really is just to add them in yourself and just experiment, and you can come up with some pretty cool effects and ideas very quickly if you just play around. All right, so the next thing I want to touch on are the per object settings. So if you right click, we've already covered the freeze selection, unfreeze all, hide selection. Then you can also move, rotate, scale. We've covered those. You can clone the object, right? So you can just make a copy and there's a copy right on top of it. So that can be useful. You can also go to the object properties. So you're gonna use this a lot, actually, more than maybe you think, because mainly you can make this not renderable. So that's very helpful. You can make it not visible to camera. So actually sometimes you want the object to be shown in reflections, maybe in the floor, but you don't want it to be shown to the camera, to the eye. Just it will show up in reflections and refractions, right? So you can control all of these different settings per object. So you can make it not visible to reflections. You can make it not receive shadows or cast shadows. Now you can also make it see-through, right? So if I do that, you can see what that does. You can also do that by just hitting Alt-X. So if you do Alt-X shortcut on your keyboard, you can make it see-through. So again, this is helpful if you have several objects behind each other. This way you can just see what's going on. Or maybe you have some particles inside of this donut and you want to be able to see them, so you can just do Alt-X to see what's inside. It's sort of like X-ray vision. Then also you can do display as box. So sometimes you don't really need to see the whole donut, you just want sort of a reference for it. So it'll just show you this empty wireframe box in place of the donut, even though the torus is still there. So I can just turn off display as box and it's still there. And then of course you also have your freeze and hide for the selection, and you can rename it here as well. So just want you to know that this is there, the object properties. Mainly you're gonna again use it to make it not renderable or display as box. That's what I do most often. All right, so next up, I do wanna give you the basics of animation, even though I said I will make a separate tutorial for this, and I will, but again, just to cover the absolute basics. First, you just wanna click on this time configuration and select what frames per second you want to work on and how long you want your timeline to be. So maybe I want 200 frame timeline and I want to work in, let's say, custom 25 frames per second, or let's do 24, and let's just say okay. So now if I just hit playback, then that's what I'm going to be getting, but nothing is animated yet. So you essentially have two options. You can either do auto key or set key. There is a difference between them, right? So if I do auto key, you will just go to the frame where you want to make a change. So let's say 40, and then just move this forward. And you can see it automatically created 2 keyframes for you. So that's the main difference between auto key and set key, is that auto key will create the beginning keyframe for you. That's why it's called auto key. It does that automatically. So it automatically created a keyframe for the beginning where we were on frame 0, and then it created a keyframe on frame 40 where we moved the sphere. So now if I go to frame 80 and I move this here, it's gonna create another keyframe for me automatically. So now it's going from 0 to 40 to 80. I'm gonna go back to 0 and do this one more time so you can see that, right? So I'm starting with no keyframe. I'll just go to frame 40 and watch what happens. As I move this forward, it automatically created the beginning keyframe here and another keyframe on frame 40. And then whenever I make a change, so I can move this, I don't just have to move it, I can also scale it, and I can also rotate it, and it will automatically remember and set the keyframes for all those. So that's auto key for you. Now I'm gonna delete all those keyframes, and this time I'll just set it to set key. Now if I go to frame 40, if I move this forward on frame 40, you see absolutely nothing happens. It just snaps back. That's because we need to set a key. Like manually, you need to click on set key, or you can hit K on your keyboard, and then you go to frame 40, move this forward and set key again. So now we've created two keys and the animation is created between those two keys. So now if I go to frame 80 and I move this here, I need to set a key again to get those three animation points to happen. So by default, I am creating this auto tangent curve for the keyframes. What does that mean? Well, just watch what happens. As the sphere moves, it accelerates slowly and then it stops slowly, right? If I go back to frame 0, it'll start slowly, then slow down, and then speed up again and slow down. That's because there is a curve for the animation. So if I select all the keyframes and open the curve editor, I can set this to set tangents to linear, close, and now it'll have constant speed from beginning to end. There's no slow acceleration because the curve is just linear. So again, I'll have a separate tutorial just for animation where we dive deeper into this, where we actually go into the curve editor and play with the curves more, but just wanted to give you the absolute basics here again. So it's important that you understand the difference between auto key and set key, how to set keys, how to set up your time configuration, and change the keys from smooth or curved to linear. All right, so next up you have this toggle scene explorer. So I showed you how to do this earlier. So if you close this by accident, you can just bring it back right here. So again, this just lists all of your objects in the scene. And this ribbon here, that's mainly used for modeling, and we're not gonna cover modeling in this video because it's a big enough topic to deserve its own video. So what you can do to hide the ribbon is just click on this show ribbon button to hide that. Now I've prepared a simple scene because to cover these material editor and rendering settings, I actually want to render a simple scene. Now before we get into that, you notice these selection highlights, right? So if I hover over an object, it's gonna get this yellow highlight around it, and if I select it, that highlight turns blue. Now this is something that I don't like. I turn it off because I feel like the scene is too messy. There's just too many selection things going on. So I can hit F4 to hide the edged faces to make it a bit less messy. But still, I'm not a big fan of these selection highlights. So you can go under File, Preferences, and you can go under Viewports and just uncheck this Selection Preview Highlights and say OK. And then you're not gonna get those highlights anymore. And one more related thing that I want to show you is, you see whenever you select an object, you're gonna get these selection brackets, these white brackets around the object. If that's something you want to get rid of, you can just click on Standard and then go to Per View Presets. Then you can go under Per View Preferences and just uncheck selection brackets, right? And they're gonna just disappear. So usually the way I personally want to just be able to tell if something is selected or not is with the edged faces. So if you have edged faces selected, whenever you select an object, the edged faces are going to turn white. So that's all I personally need as my selection indicator. I don't really want the selection highlights or the selection brackets. So that's just something I want you to also know that you can do. So just to get back to lighting and rendering. In 3ds Max 2022, if you go under your render setup, or you can hit F10, Arnold is your default renderer. And to see how things are looking rendered, you can just go under Standard and enable ActivShade using Arnold. So if you're familiar with V-Ray, this is similar to V-Ray interactive rendering. This is basically a real-time rendering preview of what this scene will look like rendered. Now we already have some default 3ds Max lights illuminating the scene, but I actually want to create our own lights. So I'll just go under Create, Lights, Arnold, and just create an Arnold light, enable Auto Grid, and just click here. And I can just hit W again to move the light and move it up. Let's hit F4 to disable edged faces. And we can barely see anything, and that's just because the intensity of the light is too small. So I'll just hit R and scale this light up a little bit. And then under the Modify panel, we can go under Intensity and keep raising the intensity of the light until we see more. Right, so I can also just maybe move this light to the left and rotate it a little bit. And I can hit W, hold Shift, copy, move this over here, and just rotate it the other way. So all the shortcuts and everything we've learned is starting to pay off. Now, if I wanted to just apply some nicer materials to this, I can open the material editor and I can just drag out a physical material in here. And I'll have a separate tutorial that just covers the materials and everything. But for now, you can just go under presets and maybe select glossy paint and set the color to something like maybe orange. And I can just select my torus knot and then say assign material to selection up here. And now that plastic orange is assigned to my torus knot. Now, if I wanted to just render this scene as it is, I can just click on render production or shift Q, and it's going to use Arnold to render the scene. And this is my final rendered result. So now I can just click on save image and I can save this image into my computer. Usually I would just save it as an EXR and then bring it into After Effects, do some post-production and then export it as a JPEG, or you can just save it as a JPEG file straight from 3ds Max. That's also okay. Now, as far as some of the render settings, this is something that deserves its own video, right? Like there's a lot of settings for Arnold. Rendering, I'm really just covering the absolute basics. So you can pick your resolution here. So you can make it 1920 by 1080. You can make it 4K if you wanted to. You can select if you want to render just a single frame or an animation. And then you can select where you want to save the file. So you can select the folder in your computer here, and when it's finished rendering, it will save the image into this folder. So when it comes to 3D modeling and animation, so auto key, set key, and animating objects, I'll have separate videos for those. So you can check the links for those in the description where we dive deeper into just those topics. This is really just an introduction to 3ds Max as a whole. So we've learned about viewports, selecting, rotating objects. I've showed you a lot of the different settings you can do, right? Shift+F to show the save frames. We've covered all of these different buttons and settings up here. The creation panel, creating some lights with Arnold rendering. So definitely if you're completely new to 3ds Max, I would encourage you to experiment and play with, how to navigate the viewport, how to do all of these basic things. I hope that you learned a lot. If you did, as always, I would appreciate a thumbs up. If you enjoy my style of teaching, I have 100 more tutorials on my channel, RedefineFX. So definitely check those out, and don't forget to subscribe because I'll be uploading more tutorials. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.